If you're visiting York and you've seen the sights and the sights relating to Anne Lister in the centre of York, you might find this book quite handy. Then can I suggest you take a longer walk? It would be fitting, after all. Anne liked nothing better than a good walk. And one place I might suggest is that you take a walk down Bootham. Bootham is an ancient route. It's the route to Scotland. Beneath the bar, which is the term we use for the gateways here in York, lie the remains of the Porta Principalis Dextra, the northwest entrance to the Roman fortress of Eboracum. There's been an entrance to the city here for nearly 2,000 years. Anne would have been very familiar with Bootham Bar. Tib Norcliffe lived just inside the city, and the school where Anne and Eliza met, the Manor School, was just outside the city walls. Things changed a little during Anne's lifetime. In the middle of the 1830s, this road was punched through the walls to alleviate the shocking traffic here in York. Anne heard about the architect of the new street, called St Leonard's Place, from Parsons, a hairdresser, and Jonathan Gray, a solicitor, called him a rising man. We'll hear more about him later. So you can see the whole of this episode on Bootham on YouTube now, along with a couple of other things. Otherwise, we'll put out little excerpts over the next few days so you can see Anne's travels along Bootham. So for now, let's head off. And as her and Mariana did in 1817, let's sally forth and go and visit Lady Johnston. This was the townhouse of Lord Richard and Lady Margaret Vanden Bempter Johnston. It was built for them in 1804, and as a Member of Parliament, he had been created baronet in 1795. This was the year he married his second wife, 40 years his junior, Margaret, or, as Anne refers to her, Lady Johnston. I think Anne was quite impressed with Lady Johnston. When she bumps into her in the street, she tells us, "Her ladyship made very civil speech to me, to say she would have taken an earlier opportunity to call on me had she not known I was only going to stay for a day or two." Sounds like a bit of an excuse to me. Anne did get to come here to party, though. Her and Miss Marsh in February 1820 came to a bit of a rout, which must have been quite good because they didn't leave till after 11 p.m. Anne was also really impressed with Lady Johnston's modern contrivances. Apparently, something that you fit on the bottom of a door to make it open and shut more smoothly over the carpets. In 1827, the Dowager Lady Johnston, she'd lost her husband 20 years earlier, decides to sell up. And Charles Lawton, Mariana's husband, proposes to buy the house. Of course, Anne has an opinion on this. She's clearly sceptical of Charles' business acumen and says he'll probably pay double what it's worth. She's also concerned that after having her own place in the country, York might seem too provincial a town to suit Mariana's tastes. On that particular day, she seemed to have a rather negative view of York. In a letter to Mariana, she suggested that she should probably not care to vegetate among the old maids and scandal here in York. She did, however, have more positive associations with Bootham. Let's head off a bit further. Whenever you're out and about, it's always good to look out for blue plaques. And on this house here is one dedicated to someone who Anne had known since she was a baby. This is the plaque dedicated to Mary Ellen Best, or known as Ellen to family and Anne. Born in 1809. Her mother was Mary Norcliffe Dalton, and Mary was the sister of Isabella Norcliffe, better known as Tib. When Ellen was just 14, Anne notes that she calls in to see her at the Duffins to say goodbye to her before she goes back to school in Kent. Ellen later became a very accomplished artist. Her work was admired by Anne and also by Anne Walker. After a visit in 1834, Anne writes that Miss Walker was much pleased with Miss Best's drawings. Mary Ellen leased this house in 1837. Mary Ellen Best gives us a real insight into Anne's world. We don't know that Anne ever visited the house, but Mary Ellen shows us inside, behind closed doors. This is Mary Ellen Best, and a self-portrait that she did. Anne knew her well. Here's a picture that Mary Ellen did here. And Anne Norcliffe Dalton was the sister of Tib Norcliffe, Anne's friend. And Mary Ellen paints pictures of many of the places that Anne would have known. The Duffins drawing room in Micklegate and the dining room at Langton, with thought to be a picture of Tib in it. We can even visit the artist at work in her painting room of the house across the road. Here we have Mary Ellen Best at work in her studio. This is St. Peter's School, one of the oldest schools in the world. It was founded by St. Paulinus in 627 AD. It moved here in 1844, but it amalgamated with the York Preparatory School, who had commissioned this wonderful frontage you see behind me, with its Gothic gable, those octagonal open turrets, canopied niches, and a beautiful oriel window with open stonework. It was done during the late 1830s, and something that Anne must have witnessed happening. It was done by none other than John Harper, who was the architect at Shibden Hall. Harper was creating quite a stir in the city with his designs for an entire new street called St. Leonard's Place. Anne obviously liked what she saw, and on the 13th of April 1835 comments that Jonathan Gray, her solicitor, had described him as a rising man who gives great satisfaction with his work. Not one to delay, Anne then makes arrangements to see him the very next day at the Black Swan. And they decided to work together from there on. And on and off, Jonathan Harper worked with her on her designs for Shibden, as funds and time would allow. You can see in this journal from 1978, produced by the Yars, York Architectural and York Archaeological Society, that there were great plans for Shibden Hall. It's a wonderful article entitled John Harper at Shibden, a Gothic lady and her architect. But just look at the original plans here that were held out for Shibden. And you can see that it had time allowed for John and Anne to complete what they hoped for Shibden. Then Shibden may well have had its architectural twin right here in Bootham. When Anne says in her diaries she went to the Burton Stone, you might have wondered what it was. Well, this is it here, the Burton Stone. It's an ancient piece of stone, first recorded in 1597, but most likely used for centuries before then as a boundary marker or the base of a cross. You can see in it these huge indentations. It's thought that during the early 1600s, when York suffered a dreadful bout of plague, this was where the people, the victims of the plague, would put their money immersed in vinegar to disinfect it, so people could take the money free of the plague and leave provisions for them to survive. Sometimes when Anne visits the Burton Stone or passes the Burton Stone, she also tells us she's on her way to see Mrs. Henry Robinson too, Let's go a couple of doors up and see Mrs. Henry Robinson. A couple of doors down from the Burtonstone is the home of Mrs. Henry Robinson. Mrs. Henry Robinson, formerly Rosamond Best, was the older sister of Mary Ellen Best and also the niece of Tib Norcliffe, another place where Anne often came to call. But she didn't come to Clifton only to see Mrs. Robinson. Let's go see who else she was visiting up here. This is Clifton Green, once the heart of the village of Clifton, which was a little village that lay outside the city walls in York. Anne came here often, to this building here, formerly Dr. Belcome's private asylum. This was where Anne's first lover, Eliza Raine, spent a large part of her life. Anne and Eliza met at the manor school. She'd been born in Belpre, the Eurasian area of Chennai in India. She was the daughter of William Raine, a surgeon in the East India Company. Such was the despicable practice at the time, Eliza's mother, who was an Indian lady, was not even named on the birth certificate. When her father died, Eliza was sent to England and ended up in the care of her father's former colleague, Dr. William Duffin. At the manor school, the two outsiders developed an intense relationship. They developed the crypt hand, the code that Anne used throughout her life so they could communicate in secret. They had an intense relationship and promised themselves to each other for life. But that was not to be, not through any fault of anyone. But as with many teenage relationships, Anne Lister realised there was a big world out there and she moved on. It seems that Eliza's fragile mental health meant she couldn't cope with this rejection, on top of all the other rejections and traumas she'd suffered during her life. And in 1814, she was admitted to Dr. Belcome's private asylum. By 1816, she was institutionalised and spent the rest of her life in one form of private asylum or another. Dr. Henry Stephen Belcome, or Steph as Anne refers to him, was the older brother of the love of Anne's life, Mariana Belcome. Anne seems to think that Eliza does very well at this asylum, and that Mrs. Clarkson's, the matron, seasonal control and Clifton's discipline suits Eliza well. On the 25th of November 1818, Anne tells us, "We walked to Clifton to see Eliza Raine for a few minutes. She was looking much as usual, though Mr. Duffin thought she wouldn't have spoken to me were it not for the half a pound of queen cakes I'd taken her." This asylum closed in 1853 and Eliza moved on to her final home in Osbaldwick, where she died in 1860. I hope you've enjoyed a little walk down Bootham with me. Don't forget, you can discover other Anne Lister related sites in the book here. But do take a little stroll down Bootham. It's really pretty and you'll be walking right in the footsteps of Anne Lister.